Hello and welcome to the studio. I'm Dale Molnar, and today I want to invite you into the process of an artwork I'm about to undertake. As an artist, I consider myself an image maker, and I will use whatever medium and process is appropriate to the image I'm trying to achieve. Today I'm going to start working on the image of a sea turtle that's being viewed from actually under the water. This is an image that I've done a few different times over the years. I originally did a watercolor, and then this is a photograph of a mural that I did that was for a little girl's room under the sea. Years ago, I was on a dive in the Bahamas, and as I was going deeper, there was a parrotfish, and the fish sort of shadowed me, followed me down, and I was struck with how the deeper I went, the colors of the fish changed, because the amount of water between the fish and I and the light source, the sun, kept increasing, and the amount of lumens kept decreasing. So lost the upper end of the spectrum, and the fish went from having bright, reds and colors into being just blues and greens. I also noticed on that dive that looking out into the distance, the fish that I saw were very muted and also mostly blues and greens, very, very pale, muted. It's sort of the same thing that happens when you look at distant mountains. The mountains are much less vibrant, very muted, and much less focused. There's not as much detail. So I'm going to use these principles in the image that I'm going to make of the sea turtle. And I decided it would be really interesting if I could use sea glass or beach glass. Now, the difference between beach glass and sea glass is sea glass comes from a saltwater source and beach glass comes from a freshwater source, but the process is the same. The glass is tumbled with an aggregate, usually sand, and it becomes etched. And I thought that would be a very appropriate way to make the very distant parts of the image that I'm undertaking. I went and gathered some sea glass. There were a couple of inherent problems that I encountered. One is the glass is all sorts of different thicknesses. It's very inconsistent and shapes, and a very limited palette because, let's face it, most sea glass comes from people throwing beer bottles and wine bottles into the ocean. So I decided that I could overcome those problems by taking regular stained glass and tumbling it. I got a commercial tumbler used for tumble polishing stones, and that way I would be able to really be articulate about the palette, about developing my palette. I tumbled lots of different glass. Some of it was very, very useful, and some of it just wasn't. The cobalt blue glass that I thought was going to be wonderful turned out to be way too dark, even when it was etched on the surface. And some of the greens just didn't work. Some of it was way too opaque. I wanted that contrast between the etched glass, which diffuses the light, and the glass in the foreground that I'm going to use, which will be cathedral glass, where the light will go through the glass, reflect off of the substrate, and then come back through the glass. So it will be refracted light. And I'm also going to use opaque glass for the turtle itself, and the contrast of the two will give the difference between the density of the turtle and the fluidity of the glass. I'm using lots of different tones so that instead of just a single field of color that is only activated by andamento, by the movement and direction of how the tesserae are laid, there are slight differences in tone. And to achieve some more of that depth of field, here I have two pieces of glass that are the same tone. One is a clear cathedral, and one is what's called a seedy cathedral. That is, it has little tiny air bubbles, so that when the light goes through and comes back, it gets refracted off of those bubbles and is muted just ever so slightly. And I'm trying to achieve various levels of the etching. So I've taken some glass and put it through the tumbler for several days, and then some glass for just a couple of days. And I'm right at the point where I want to make that transition from the etched glass into the cathedral glass. And what I really need to do is just beat up the glass just a little tiny bit. And so I'm going to try something other than the sand or a grit that I was using. Originally, I used a commercial grit. It's carborundum. It's a 6090 grit that is usually used for tumble polishing stones, but I'm not polishing the glass. I'm just doing the first step of rounding it off slightly and etching the surface. And I actually found that just the regular sand, which really simulates what happens with beach glass, worked even better than the commercial grit. But now I'm at the point where I want just ever so slightly to beat up the glass, so I'm going to do something else entirely. What I've decided to just beat up the glass a little bit is I'm going to use a much more aggressive aggregate. I'm going to use quartz rock. Because the quartz is crystalline, when it's broken up, it has very sharp edges, and I will tumble the glass for just a very short amount of time and just get a little bit of texture on the surface. It'll have a little more refraction than the seedy cathedral, but less refraction than the etched glass pieces. So I have my cylinders for tumbling here. The first thing I'll do is put on the safety goggles, and I have a piece of steel, and I have my chunks of quartz. I'll take a ball peen hammer. This is going to be noisy. And I end up with pieces that have very sharp edges, and I'll load them into the cylinder. And like I said, I'll just use them for a short amount of time. All right, so I've loaded some of my coarse aggregate into the tumbler. Now I'm going to add the glass to tumble. I'm using some of the seedy cathedral and some other cathedrals. And I'll cut some initial tesserae shapes. And I'll continue to fill All right, so I'm just about ready. I filled the cylinders for the tumbler about half full. that gives them plenty of room for the wave action as it rolls around. I'm using just a regular glass cutter, has a very fine steel wheel, and essentially you don't cut glass, you scratch it and you break it. I'm using running pliers. The running pliers basically is a fulcrum underneath pushing up and two pieces on top pushing down that splits the glass. And then I'm using regular tile snips to cut the tesserae. And later on, when I'm actually working on the finished piece, I may take a tesserae to make it fit properly and shape these pieces even more. I have it about half full, and now I add water, utilizing that wine bottle that was inappropriate because of the curvature. It becomes a great water carrier. But you just barely cover the surface, and then close the cylinders up. And it's ready to start tumbling. Now, on the glass that was the furthest away, I actually tumbled that glass for several days, and then these successive piles of color I tumbled less time. The last one was for just one day. With this, I will probably tumble it for just an hour and then see. Even that may be too much. I may have to adjust a little more or a little less to get the exact amount of etching that I'm after. So I've retrieved the cylinder from the machine. It ran for about an hour. I tested it earlier at half an hour and it wasn't quite far enough along. And I'll test it again. What I want to have is just a very slight reduction in the sheen so that I have that transition from the etched glass to the unetched glass. I just used the hub as the handle to open up the cylinder. I'll test it by taking some of the glass and rinsing the slurry off. And then drying it, because when the glass is wet, you won't be able to tell how much the sheen has been reduced, since the water will add the sheen back to it. And then once this is dry, I will test it, and if it has just that slight reduction, then I'm ready to start working on the building process. I will have accumulated my palette of colors. And when I start working on the accumulation here, I will work out little vignettes, little passages of the andamento, of the flow of the water. It will be mostly a horizontal flow, except around the turtle itself. I will work this out. I'll work out all of those passages and put the tesserae onto a shelf paper, basically upside down so that the sticky side will hold the pieces in place. And I'll keep working back and forth until I get it exactly the way I want it to be before I commit to the substrate. In this photograph of a sea turtle, I don't know if this will show up for you, but you can see around the turtle, you can actually see the disturbance in the water of the turtle moving through the water, because the ripples and currents within the water will reflect the light slightly differently. And that will help with the andamento. The turtle will have the form defined by the direction of the tesserae, and the water will have the movement defined by the direction of the tesserae. Okay, so now that the piece is complete, I wanted to go over a few of the visual techniques that I employed. It's basically a figure-ground relationship, the turtle and then the water. But rather than have the water just be a field of color, there are several things that have been used to activate that area. First of all, the andamento, the direction and flow of the tesserae, and in some instances, changing the shapes of the flow, so it's not just a horizontal blue field. I employed using slightly different hues, but in the same tonal range, so that you get some more interest. And then another technique was to use little tiny bits of the complementary color. And this sort of stimulates the foveal region in our eyes and activates the field of blue. I'm using a slightly red-orange because the aqua is a slightly blue, a slightly green side of the blue. And then additional to that, there's also very subtle differences that can be used, where I take the stained glass and flip some of the tesserae over. And the reason for that is that a lot of stained glass, not blown antique or continuous run glass, but a lot of the glass, as it comes through the roller and goes through the lure for annealing, will have an upside, which becomes the face and is much smoother, and a backside, which can have some texture. So even though it's the exact same glass and the same density, some of the tesserae have been flipped over. Finally, another technique that I employed was to tip the tesserae. If they're tipped up slightly towards the light, since this hangs on a wall, it'll be much brighter. There'll be a little spark of light. Or if it's tipped down, it'll be in shadow. And even though it's the exact same glass, if one of the tesserae is tipped down, it'll present with a slightly different tone. This technique was used by mosaicists when they were doing domes, which weren't all very smooth, a huge plaster dome. And the mosaicist would tip the tesserae to pick up the candlelight for accenting the highlight in an eye or some highlight, some particular area in the imagery. And I've done that same thing, so that there are just a few, not too many. None of these techniques are overly done, but just enough to activate without competing. So the water, the field of blue, doesn't compete with the figure of the turtle, but it's also not boring.